Okay, now I'm going to pick up with Unit 7B, talking about the second half of Unit 7 here, dealing with Great Depression. 1920s was an era of great prosperity, but there were underlying economic problems that wound up getting us into the Great Depression. So let's talk about these. Once again, you could spend an entire semester just on this little stuff about the Great Depression. So we're only going to roller skate through it. Right after World War I, there was a big crash in the economy. This is very early 1920s, but it was brief. Suddenly, the government had stopped buying stuff, having bought all that stuff for the war. And suddenly, millions of men were returning, all looking for jobs. So the economy crashed for a moment, but then it very quickly picked up again. You had new consumer items. Cars were becoming freely available to middle class. You had washing machines and primitive dishwashers, telephones, refrigerators, radios would start to come in as a consumer item, and people would sit around listening to radio programs. Credit was expanding. This is very important. People were buying on time. Buy now, pay later. So they would buy the radio and pay off a little at a time. You were basically borrowing the money for it. There was better transportation. Trolleys, streetcars, expanding subways, more cars on the roads. That means people move to the suburbs and start to build new houses and build new communities. Farmers grow more. There's better farming techniques. You have tractors now, so you don't need horses. So the grazing land that you were using for the horses, you can now turn into farmland. You can grow twice as much. Food was cheaper. Better transport and better canning technology, believe it or not, meant a wider variety of cheaper foods, easy to prepare. So now you could can those string beans in the summer and have string beans out of a can in February. However, you had some really deep problems here. One, farm prices. Farming was actually in a lot of trouble, but people didn't seem to notice. Farmers mortgage their farms to borrow money. So they borrow money from the bank, and they say, if I can't pay it, you get to take the farmland. That's a mortgage. I'm going to completely make up stupid numbers here, because the numbers don't matter, the idea does. So I'm just making up easy numbers. You borrow, you farmer, let's say $100 from the bank now that you're going to pay back in months from now at harvest time. When they borrow, at that time when they borrow, wheat is selling for, say, $100 a bushel. So the farmer grows 2 bushels, pays his bill with $100, and takes the other 100 as a profit. Pretty good. But what if the price drops to $50 a bushel? Now, just to make the same amount of money, you've got to grow 4 bushels, not 2. But so do their neighbors. The law of supply and demand kicks in. The more bushels, the lower the price. So now you have to grow 8 bushels, then 16, just to keep up. Well, you can't keep up. You can't pay the debt. The bank forecloses and takes your farmland. You're out of work. You're out of a job. But now what? The bank is stuck with land it can't sell, because nobody wants farmland now, and the bank can't make its money back. So the bank goes bankrupt, out of business. Depositors, the little guys with savings account, that's their life savings, the bank goes bankrupt, they lose all their money, they're wiped out. They can't buy anything now, so the local stores, the grocery stores, the butcher shops, they're going out of business, etc. So when the farms start to fail, you see you're setting yourself up for the sort of domino effect of everything falls then from it. Overproduction on the farm, but also in the factories. Same principle works in the factories, whether you're making washing machines or telephones. It sets you up for a coming collapse. Got another problem. Consumer debt. Consumers are borrowing on credit to buy all those new gadgets. They are way in debt. They borrow on margin to buy stocks. So when you borrow money from the broker to go buy stocks, that's called buying stocks on margin. It's like gambling with borrowed money. If you win, great, but if you lose, you still owe the money. So you buy stock at $10, thinking tomorrow it'll go up to 15. You'll sell it at 15, keep the $5, and give the other 10 back to the broker because you borrowed the money from him. But what happens if the price of that stock is not 15, but goes down to 7? Now you've got to sell it. You've lost money. You give the broker back 7. You still owe the broker $3. Why do you think that stock is going to go up? You buy a share of XYZ company, convinced it's going to go up from $10 to 15. Why? Well, sometimes there's a reason. Analysts look at companies and they try to figure out if they're going to be more profitable and people are going to want the stock. But a lot of the people who are buying stocks at this time in the 20s, they're buying it based on a gut feeling, a hunch, a rumor. That's what's called a bubble. A bubble blows up big, but there's nothing inside of it. And eventually, it pops. The 1929 stock market crash was a symptom, not a cause of the Great Depression. At the same time stocks fail, banks are failing, real estate, like with the farms, is failing. It's all going down together. Businesses fail, people lose jobs, they can't pay their bills, more businesses failed, and suddenly you've got 25% plus unemployment and more underemployment, people who are cut back in hours or cut back in salary. So that's really what's going on here. That overproduction and the fundamental weaknesses in the economy are what set you up for the tumble that's going to start in 29. And the stock market is just sort of the first domino to fall. When the Great Depression hits, Herbert Hoover is president. What does Hoover do? And simply, nothing. Government shouldn't borrow from future generations to keep people happy today, says Hoover. If I start spending a lot of government money, I'm going to have to borrow it. That's going to saddle debt to your children. Says Hoover, if government tries to fix the economy, step in and fiddle with it, it will not fix it, and it will just prolong the pain. Laissez-faire, leave it alone. Private charity should care for the poor, says Hoover, that's good, but it will all turn around quickly, and once it turns around, we'll all be good. Unfortunately, it doesn't. And you begin to get Hoovervilles. 1930, 1931, 1932. It's not getting any better. The bonus army is a big blunder by Hoover. Thousands, putting this in now, of veterans march on Washington demanding their future bonus pay set for 1945 as a reward for fighting in World War I. Now, thousands of veterans march on Washington demanding their future bonus pay, set for 1945 as a reward for fighting World War I. Now, they go to Washington and say, we want it now, we need it. Hoover has them forcibly pushed out of Washington, and the whole American public is shocked. People are giving up hope, and they're turning to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, let me just show you a bit here. When we talk about Hoovervilles, again, we're talking about, if you remember, those shanty towns that sprang up all over America. People lost everything, including their homes. And so they found garbage dumps, open land, edges of the city, railroads, sometimes even in public parks, and built these towns of shacks like this. And you see how big some of these are. Every alley had these kind of towns. You see the shacks are made of whatever wood they could find to put something up and try to live in. This is one in Central Park right here in New York. They just took over a piece of the park and started living in it. Let me pull this down here. The bonus marchers, if you remember, were all of these veterans who fought in World War I, were told in 1920 that they were going to get a bonus, a kind of pension payment 25 years from then, when most of them would be like thinking about retiring. Tens of thousands of them from all over America go to Washington, D.C. and camp out for weeks, protesting on the steps of the Capitol. In a perfectly orderly way, by the way. They were all old soldiers, and so they followed the rules, they organized themselves, they kept their camp clean, but they stayed there and stayed there and stayed there, demanding that Congress do something for them. Eventually, Hoover sees them as a national embarrassment to him. It's a proof that his plans are not working. So he orders the army to move them out, and they move them out by attacking them. Hoover didn't really order them to do that. That's just what they decide. Well, if he wants us to move them out. And they set fire to their camp and burn them out. And there in the shadow of the Capitol, you've got this violent confrontations taking place. Those are DC cops that are moving in there. And here you have guys who fought in the war, defending themselves even with an American flag as they're being pushed out. So that smoke around the Capitol building, this becomes Hoover's downfall. It's so shocking that in the 1932 election, Hoover's had it, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes along with a completely different idea. Roosevelt comes in 1932, he's elected. He takes office in 1933, with what he calls, of course, his New Deal for America. He immediately takes action. Within a few days, he does his first of his fireside chats, a radio address. He sat there speaking on the radio, and the radio was very intimate. It was like speaking one-to-one with the president himself, talking to the American people, explaining simply, but as though he's talking to adults, what he's doing. He tells them about the bank holiday. He closes all of the banks in the country. which may seem like it's going to freak you out, but it doesn't. He tells them, I'm going to do this. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to close all the banks. But don't worry. They're going to reopen in a couple of days. But they're going to reopen one by one. And we are going to certify each bank as being solid. And if a bank isn't solid, we're going to check it. If it's not a solid bank, we will merge it with a solid bank. The government will force this. That way, when it reopens, you will have rock-solid confidence that your money is safe and you don't have to panic. Famously, he has his 100 days. The first 100 days, the first 3 months or so in office, there is this tidal wave of government spending and programs. It's the absolute opposite of Hoover. Hoover said, keep your hands off the economy. It will fix itself. If you try to interfere, you will make it worse and just prolong the problem. FDR adopts what is known as Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics says, it's named for John Maynard Keynes. There was the guy the economist who thought up. Keynes says, in times of national emergency, the government should spend, borrowing whatever they need now. The government spending is what's going to push the economy to restart. It's like priming a pump. If you've ever tried to pump a dry pump, it doesn't work well. But if you fill it up with water first and then start pumping, it'll start sucking the water out of the pool or whatever it is you're trying to do. That's what Keynes believes. Keynes says once the economy becomes prosperous again, you're going to get taxes, because as the economy starts making money, you automatically get a piece of that in taxes anyway, and so it will all pay for itself. Don't worry. Now, Keynesian economics remains to this day controversial, as does Hoover's laissez-faire approach. But this is the approach FDR decides to take. When you think of the New Deal, always think RRR. 3 R's. Relief, recovery, reform. Relief, address the immediate emergency. Recovery, now get the economy rolling again. Reform, prevent this, I should say, from ever happening again. Relief, the bank holiday we just talked about. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Public Works Administration, PWA. They start tens of thousands of building projects, roads and bridges, post offices, hospitals, city halls, parks, to create, the federal government is paying for this, to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Every time you rebuild a park or a post office, you need carpenters, engineers, draftsmen, plumbers, just strong back day laborers. So you're creating all of those jobs for all of those guys. He starts the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This scooped up thousands of young men from cities, gave them a job. It was not forced. They hired these guys, put them out in national parks, out in Wyoming and Idaho, and put them to work rebuilding them. It got them outdoors. It was healthy work. It gave them a job and a purpose. And they sent a couple of their bucks home every week to the folks back home. He sets up the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which builds dams on the Tennessee River. Well, so what? It ended the awful flooding that used to wipe out towns along the Tennessee rivers. It also provided electricity to huge areas of very poor people. These farmers out in Tennessee, Kentucky, that whole area, a lot of them had no electricity on their farms. This provides cheap electricity, and it creates more jobs, construction. And Not just the construction jobs, but following on. You need concrete to build those dams. So now the concrete companies are hiring guys to help make the concrete. You need electric wire. Well, now you got companies that are hiring guys to mine copper and then other guys to turn it into wire. Okay, that's relief. Let's get people to work, put some dollars in their pocket. Gives unemployed men hope, identity, cash. What do I mean by that? These guys hadn't had jobs, some of them in years. It gives them a chance to say maybe things are looking up. It gives them an identity. Good or bad, like it or not, guys identify themselves with their jobs. If you ask a guy, who are you? If you ask a woman who she is, often you're going to hear, oh, I'm so-and-so's mother, I'm so-and-so's wife. And it's not a sexist thing, it's just women tend to think of themselves in relationship to other people. If you ask a guy, who are you? The first thing that's going to pop into his head is, I'm a cop, I'm a fireman, I'm an accountant, I'm a teacher. Guys tend to identify with a job. When they lose their job, it's psychologically very devastating because, like, now who am I? What am I doing when I get up in the morning? And it also provides cash in their pocket to help them get through the day and pay their bills. Okay, so that's relief. Recovery. Get the national economy rolling again. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, boosts up farm prices. Federal home loan programs, loans to buy a new house, gets the house building industry creating more jobs, and you get a more permanent economy because, again, you need all this stuff to build the house, so now you're pushing along all of those manufacturing industries. The National Recovery Act, a federal government program that tried to set prices and set wages for workers. This later got struck down by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. Remember that. So relief, recovery, now reform. To prevent the Great Depression from ever happening again. The Glass-Steagall Act said banks and brokerages have to be separate things. Banks can't use their depositors' money to gamble on the stock market. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. Banks had to follow strict rules, but if they did, the federal government would insure their accounts. So if the bank ever went bankrupt, depositors would keep their money. So if a bank goes out of business, your savings account is insured. You're going to get your money even if the bank isn't there. Because the rules are so good, FDIC has never actually had to pay for a failing bank. No FDIC bank has ever failed. So it shows the rules work. And it exists, by the way, to this very day. Social Security. Before that, there was no national pension system. If you were too old or too sick to work, you were just flat out of luck. Now with Social Security, people who couldn't work, who couldn't go to work on one of those projects or those programs, at least they knew that they wouldn't fall into complete poverty. It paid something to the elderly and the disabled. Security and Exchange Commission, SEC, ended margin buying of stocks and set rules of fairness and honesty for the market. And it still acts as sort of the cops of the market today. And the National Labor Relations Act gave workers a right to unionize. Now let me point out results of all this. This did not solve the Great Depression. If you look at the Great Depression, look at FDR's programs and say, did he fix it? It did not. The country doesn't really come out of the Depression until World War II. When there's a huge uptick in demand, the government is buying all kinds of stuff to supply the war, and there's 100% employment because any guy is being scooped up by the draft into the army. So what did the New Deal do? It gave people hope when they were hopeless. It made people feel like government was doing something, and maybe we'd get out of this. It gave many people a job, and at least some income at the very worst of times. It prevented, maybe, perhaps, the kinds of revolutions that led to Hitler or Mussolini. If the government hadn't done something, would we have had riots in the streets the way they did in Germany? That's possible. Also, no. The reform parts, relief, recovery, reform, are the ones that really worked the best. You can say that the New Deal didn't fix the Depression. However, FDIC, that bank insurance, is still with us, and no FDIC bank has failed since the Great Depression. That seems to work. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, the kind of watchdog and cops of the stock market, is still with us. It has to keep adapting to changing markets, it has to be updated all the time, but it provides a real umpire for those markets, and it still works. Social Security is still with us, and it is still something that a lot of people depend on to keep from falling into poverty. So even if you argue about the rest of the relief and recovery parts of the Depression, the recovery part you can say didn't work so well. The relief, you can say, did give people hope and did give people jobs. And the reform, many of them are still with us, and they seem to have had a permanent effect. Okay. Another thing to point out here. The Dust Bowl. We have to mention this. Students will examine the environmental and human cause of the Dust Bowl. Okay. Know this. The Dust Bowl does not cause the Depression. It is not caused by the Depression. It just very tragically happens at the same time. So it's the worst possible moment for the Dust Bowl to happen, but that's when it happens. What is it about? To farm the prairies of the Great Plains. I should say. Farmers had cut down all the trees on these big flat areas that broke up the wind. And farmers had cut open the prairie grasses. So the prairie is a big, huge, flat area that goes many, many states. And it's got this thick carpet on the top of it of deep grass roots. To farm it, they had sliced that open and peeled back, almost like peeling back a blanket, a thick blanket, off of that soil. That had revealed awesome soil, great soil, to do farming on. But it also left that soil exposed. And over the years, the soil had dried out. And without any trees to bust up the wind keeps blowing over the soil, drying it out even more. Finally, you had had a decade of almost very little rainfall in that area. This just happens sometimes meteorologically. So you wind up with this vast area of earth, soil, that is become this bone-dry paper powder. Look at me. Bone-dry powder as fine as baby powder. So as dry and as fine as baby powder, deep in the soil and as far as the eye can see. Dust storms lifted massive tonnage of soil and threw it around. People were choked to death sometimes. It destroyed towns. It buried farms in useless powdery dirt. Thousands of already poor farmers were wiped out and forced to migrate with their few poor possessions, wandering the country, mostly to California, desperate for farm work. They thought in California, because things were a little better there weather-wise, that they could get jobs on those farms. It didn't work out that way. People really did starve to death, and kids really died of malnutrition. Better soil management and smarter farming would have prevented at least some of the tragedy. So let's take a look at this real quick. When we talk about these dust storms, understand, we're not talking about the parking lot with a breeze and a few leaves around. This is what they look like. This is a town. This is a 3-story building here. And this is this dust storm approaching from the distance. I mean, oh my God. This is another photo from the time. You see, this is all, by the way, soil. So imagine how this is like a wave of solid earth, like a tsunami bearing down on you. Think about the force of this, and think about how thick this is. How are you going to breathe in that? This is a dust storm approaching in Texas. You see these things? These are called grain elevators. These are probably 5 or 6 stories tall. And these are much closer to you, obviously, the telephone poles. And this is what it looks like. It's a small one. This is what it does. This is a farm after a dust storm has passed over it. And you see how deep this is. Okay, so now imagine a layer from here down to the bottom of the wheels of this car with absolutely useless earth and as far as the eye can see. This is the area, I'll pull this out just a bit, that was affected by the dust storms. Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and part of Colorado, a little bit of New Mexico, a little bit of Nebraska. So you see how awful this is. And you had a hell of a lot of people living here as farmers. They are all wiped out. They packed up, many of them, whatever they had. You see, this is a car, and they would take whatever they owned, whatever they could move, abandon their home, tie it onto these things, and try to drive to get to California. This is another. There you got a sort of trailer here. You can't see the car. It's kind of trailer with, again, the pieces of furniture, because you took whatever you had that you might be able to sell or use, because you had no idea what the future brought. And here you see 2 little kids are part of this family. This is the most famous photograph of the whole Great Depression. This is considered the photograph that summarizes the Great Depression. There you've got a mom, you've got 2 little kids, obviously dirty. You've got a baby in there. She looks a little worried, of course. This is not really a stagey photograph. There was a famous photographer who went out and found these people. This woman was living in a tent on the side of the road. And this is typical of America of the day. This is also sadly typical. No jobs in California. Keep out. If you're looking for work, 6 men for every job. No rate relief available for non-residents. So as you arrived in California, you saw signs like this. You come in here for a job. We already have 6 men for every job here. We can't take care of our own, and we don't have any money to give you. Jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. Signed by the Chamber of Commerce. Warning guys, don't stop. Okay. So that happens, as I said, during the Great Depression, doesn't cause it, but if there's the worst time in the world for it to happen, there you go. Okay, last thing we'll talk about is this. How do we evaluate Roosevelt's leadership during the Depression? Well, we already talked about some of the programs. And as I said, the relief part, you can say, seemed to work. At least it gave people temporary hope. The reform part of it seemed to work. We still have the programs today. Recovery, not so much. What's to know, though? The Great Depression and New Deal represents a massive change in our ideas about government. Theodore Roosevelt, remember, not FDR, Theodore Roosevelt, 1900, this was FDR's distant cousin. Before Theodore, government was completely out of controlling the economy at all. Nobody thought about that. When TR is president, Teddy Roosevelt is president, he makes government a kind of referee on the field, the square deal, remember? Enforcing rules of fairness and honesty, not interfering with the economy, just setting the rules and enforcing them. Before Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes along, FDR, government was just a referee. It stayed out of the actual economy. With FDR, government is now a player, in fact, the biggest player in the economy. Government should intervene in the economy, try to steer it, and government is there to provide a safety net of support for people. How do you put that together? If you had a crash in the 1800s, nobody asked the president what he was going to do about it. Because nobody thought that the president, it wouldn't have occurred to them that that was the president's job. You have a crash today, the first question people ask is, what is the president going to do to fix it? So in the 1870s, if you had a lot of inflation, nobody would have said to, Rutherford Hayes, well, what are you doing about it? Because that wasn't the president's job. That was the economy, and you hope business fixed. In 2022, we've got a lot of inflation. First question, President Biden, how are you going to fix inflation? And that's out of New Deal, because now we expect the government to do that. It also vastly expands the power of government. Because we expect them to do that, we just assume they're going to take the power to make it happen. Okay, last item, and you better know this because they love to ask about this. They love to ask about this. Court packing. Watch. By 1937, this is the middle of the New Deal, middle of the Great Depression, the Supreme Court had started putting the brakes on FDR. FDR is elected in 32, he starts in 33, and he starts doing the New Deal. Boy, is it a different way of thinking about government and the economy. Congress goes along with a lot of it. The courts even go along with a lot of it. But by 1937, he's doing things like that NRA, National Recovery Act, that the court says isn't constitutional. The government setting prices and setting wages is socialism. It's socialistic. The Constitution does not give Congress and President power to do that. And so they say NRA is unconstitutional. They strike it down. FDR is furious. How dare they interfere with my plans? So he comes up with an idea. The Supreme Court has 9 justices. If I get Congress to expand the Supreme Court to 15, I can appoint 6 more justices who agree with me, and take a majority. It's called the plan to pack the court. And it never happens. Congress, particularly the Senate, which gave him most of the New Deal, says, we may not like the decision, but if we tamper with the institutions of government, and I guess I should point out, we may not like the court's decision, but if we tamper with the institutions of government just because we don't like a decision, we defeat the whole idea of checks and balances. If you put 6 more people on the court, what happens when the next president's got a problem? You gonna put 21 members on the court? Like, how far is this gonna go? The point is to keep these institutions stable. And checks and balances only work if we respect them. So Congress says no, and the court does not get packed. I'll just show you this. This is a famous cartoon of the day. Do we want a ventriloquist act in the Supreme Court? We know ventriloquist, it's a guy who can throw his voice, right, with a dummy. And the point here is, if we let a packed court exist, FDR is going to have these puppets on the court doing whatever he wants. This is another famous one of the time. Trying to change the umpiring. Supreme Court called President Roosevelt foul, if you want. Listen, I don't like your decisions. From now on, you're going to have to work with someone who can see things my way. In other words, these are a bunch of the acts down here. I can just pull this down. The NRA was found unconstitutional in some of the other ones. And FDR doesn't like the umpire, so he's going to change the umpire. That was kind of the attitude about the court, about the packing of the court. FDR also says, I want to furnish the Supreme Court with practical, I know you can't read that, practical assistance. There's FDR, people would have recognized his face. There's the Supreme Court. And then here's FDR and FDR and FDR and FDR and FDR and FDR, and we'll add 6 more guys to it. See that? Who really are all FDR. So it was, the FDR's attempt to pack the court was not only unpopular with Congress, but people reacted against it very, very strongly. Okay. We just zipped through this, but I'll leave it there for now.